Hi, I'm Lisa. Welcome back to our Path to Life video channel. We are in Torah 101 series. We are now in Genesis chapter 4. We begin in verse 1 with Cain and Abel. Now, as we progress into this, at this point, most people would say that we are moving on from the creation story, and the story is about Adam and Eve, and we are moving on to something different and totally leaving all of that behind. But in essence, what we're going to find out is that is not exactly true. Seriously, what we find in the story of Cain and Abel here is that it is a continuation of the story of Adam and Eve. And we're going to find that there are similar Hebrew words and phrases, sentences that are used in the story of Cain and Abel, which were also used in the story of Adam and Eve. These sentences are harder to pick up in the English, but if you go back to the Hebrew, we find that the words and the sentences are almost exactly the same. And so that teaches us a deeper depth and meaning to what exactly I think that God is trying to portray by telling us the story about Cain and Abel at all. What we find when we go back to Genesis chapter 3 is that there was a fall, and we find that there was the serpent and what was spoken over him. There was Adam and Eve and what was spoken over them. And we find that there's an expectation of salvation that is coming through the seed that the woman is going to bear, the man-child that she is going to bring forth. But what we find with Cain and Abel is that Cain and Abel and later Seth epitomize what it means to come from either the seed of the serpent or the seed of the woman, or the righteous seed or the wicked seed. What differentiates those two seeds? How can we define, or how can we discover, how can we be able to discern which seed is which? Well, really, the story of Cain and Abel is going to clarify that a lot more for us. So let's just begin. I'm going to read a little bit here. And then we're going to go back and discuss. Now, I find that generally I do really better teaching if I just try to talk off the top of my head from the knowledge that I've learned through the years, and that I don't have a lot of notes, because I don't like just staring down and reading a bunch of notes. So sometimes I'll just write a single word that triggers me as to what I want to say. And sometimes I do resort to notes. But what I'm going to do is mostly just teach off of what I've been teaching for years. So it says here in verse 1, now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and that word is yada, which means intimately knowing, or sexual relationship here. Now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. So the first thing here is that when Cain was born, she said, I have acquired an ish from the Lord, or a man. Now this would go right back to Genesis 3 and the promise of salvation coming through the conception that Eve would continually, or women in general, would continue to conceive until they brought forth one that was going to deliver them from this mess that they had gotten themselves into. So it is apparent, and even Hebrew scholars also say, that when Cain was born, Eve thought Cain was the one that would reverse the curse that they had gotten themselves into. Of course, now she's going to find out very quickly that Cain was not the one. And so what she's going to say then when Seth is born is that I've gotten another appointed one from the Lord, because Cain was not him, and Cain slew Abel. So they think that Cain is the one that's going to redeem them initially. Verse 2, then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So two things there. First of all, it seems as though Cain and Abel were twins, because it doesn't say that that Adam knew her again and she conceived and bore another son, but that she had Cain and then she bore again his brother Abel. So it seems as though that they were twins. And then we find that Abel was a keeper of sheep. Now, all throughout the Bible, we find that most of God's people are shepherds. David, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jacob's children, they were shepherds. So Abel follows in that pattern. And a shepherd was a nurturer. Okay, a nurturer, and he took care of the ground. He was a nurturer, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now that relates back to our first story of Adam and Eve in creation, because we know that Adam and Eve, that mankind came from the ground. Adam was from Adamah, or the ground, a play on words. So here Cain, we find, was a tiller of the ground. Now keep that in mind as we go along, because it is significant. Not only now that we find that Cain was a tiller of the ground, but that later, after he commits his crime, that he's going to be cursed from the ground. So that's important. Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time, it came to pass. So the Hebrew here suggests that it was at the end of some kind of time period, whether it was a festival, a Sabbath, I don't know, but it was at the end of some appointed time, designated time, that at the end of that time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. So Cain here, we have to understand that Cain was the firstborn. That is also significant in understanding this story. Firstborns in that culture, even all the way back in the very beginning of time, were a lot more important than what we think of our firstborn sons today. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. Because the firstborns were the priests of the family. They had the responsibility for the rest of the family. Adam was a priest. And then Cain was the firstborn. So that responsibility as priest of the family would fall to his shoulders, squarely on his shoulders at the death of his father. So we find here that Cain does the right thing in that he is the one that initiates the bringing of an offering to Adonai at the time, at the proper time, whatever the end of that time period was. Cain does what he is supposed to do. He's the initiator, and he brings an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord because he was a tiller of the ground. So he brought produce to the Lord, which that's okay. You can bring produce to the Lord. But it says in verse 4, Abel, who was a shepherd, Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. And Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So now the problem begins. So what has happened here? A lot of commentators cannot understand exactly why Abel's offering was not accepted. They will say things like, well, why Cain's offering was not accepted. They will say, while Abel brought the firstborn or the best of his flock and the fat, God always, when we get to the temple sacrifices, God always wanted the fat of the animal. That was his portion. So they say that Abel brought the best of his flocks, but that Cain apparently did not bring the best of the fruit of the ground. Well, I see it differently, and that is that Adam and Eve already knew what it took for a sin remission. God had already slew the first animal to cover the sins that they committed. And so here, Cain and Abel would have known what was required. Blood is always required for the remission of sins. So what kind of offering did they bring? It would have been the whole burnt offering, or the olah. Now, you can bring an offering of the ground, but the offering of the ground must also have with it, we find this in Torah, must also have with it a blood offering. And if you look up the Hebrew words here, when it says in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering, the word there is minka. He brought an offering of the fruit of the ground, a minka. Now the minka, and I may not pronounce that right in Hebrew, but the minka was was a bloodless offering. It was just his, whatever he tilled in the ground, okay? It was vegetables, fruits, whatever. It had no blood offering. Well, we find that is not acceptable to God because there must be a blood offering also presented with the grain offerings. And Adam would have known this. Adam would have taught it to his children. So you have to say, well, was God a bad parent here? Was he showing favoritism? Well, anyone that has children, if you're a proper mother and father, you know that you're not supposed to love one child above another or show favoritism to your children. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have a more needy child that you may not show that child a certain amount of, kindness or differentiate in a child that has needs above another child. But you're supposed to love all of your children and teach all of your children the same. So it's not here that God had not taught Adam and Eve, and that Adam and Eve had not passed on to Cain and Abel the proper sacrifices and the proper time to bring sacrifices. But Cain apparently wanted to do things his way. So he brought an offering of the ground without bringing a blood offering with it. Whereas Abel brought the blood offering of the flock and the fat, his firstborn of the flock. And so that is why it says that God respected Abel and his offering, but he did not respect Cain and his offering. So what happens then is that Cain becomes very angry, and his countenance, it says, falls. The word angry, his face becomes red is literally what it means. And you've seen people that were angry, red-faced, the veins on their necks, sticking out, enlarging. He was very, very angry. And who was he angry at? Well, he may have been angry at God, but most assuredly, he was angry with Abel, because that Abel's sacrifice was accepted, but his was not, and because God basically chose Abel above Cain. Verse 6 says, so the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. So basically God says, look, Cain, you have no reason to be angry. If you do the right thing, I will accept you. Okay? And if you do not do the right thing, right, then you're not going to be accepted. I'm not going to accept you. That's why I accepted your brother's offering over your offering, is because you did not do it the right way. You knew what was the acceptable sacrifice to bring. You knew you had to have a blood offering along with the grain offering, but you did not bring the blood offering. And so therefore I did not accept your sacrifice. So he tells him, look, you have a choice here, Cain. You can go and you can do the right thing and I will accept you. Or you can choose to do evil and not do the right thing, and your sacrifice will not be accepted. Now, I will say here, I'll chase this rabbit trail for just a little bit, that we must come to God. We come to God as sinners. But in order to live for God, we must do things His way, not our way. We cannot come to God and choose the way that we are going to serve God. We must serve God and honor Him the way that He desires to be honored and the way that He desires to be chosen, to be served. This book right here tells us how chosen people, why they are chosen, and how and why they are chosen is because they serve God the way that He tells them that He is to be honored and served. And Cain went his own way, just like Esau, and he wanted to do things his way and not God's way. And that is not the way it works. We must do things God's way. You can go through the motions. The children of Israel later on, they decided they wanted to do things their way, but they wanted to go through all of the motions correctly. So they continued to make sacrifices, just the way that God prescribed them. They would go to the temple and bring all their different sacrifices, and yet God says, I hate your offerings and your sacrifices. Was God saying then that he did not require sacrifices and offerings anymore? No, what he was saying is, your heart is far from me. You are going through the motions, but your heart is dirty and slimy, and you are unclean. So get your heart right with me, and then do what I commanded you to do. Now, this 7th verse here can be interpreted 2 ways. First of all, I will tell you the general interpretation, the one that, in fact, I believed most of my life until just not too many years ago, when I began to dig deeper into Scripture and study the Hebrew. And that is verse 7 says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin, this is where it starts, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Now, to me here, I envision sin as being a thing, almost like a person, and that sin is lying at the door, or it's crouching. Some translation says sin is crouching at the door, like it's a lion, ready to pounce on its prey, because its desire is for you. So sin is just trying its best to get Cain, but you should rule over it. Cain, you're going to have to rule over this sin that's just lying there, trying its best, its desire to grab hold of you. But you've got to conquer sin. Now, that's one interpretation. However, if you dig deeper into Scripture, you will find that the word sin is actually sin offering. That's correct. Sin offering. In fact, many newer translations of the Bible, including the Scriptures and some others, say that a sin offering lies at the door, or a sin offering lies nearby. So what God is really telling, in my opinion here, and you could study this out for yourself, but it makes complete sense in the context of the Scripture, that what God is really telling Cain here, again, is if you do it my way, I will accept you. If you do not, then I will not accept you. But Cain, I'm giving you here a chance to do things correctly. A sin offering is lying at the door, or a sin offering is nearby. In fact, the word lying there, the sin offering is lying at the door. It means an animal in repose, or an animal that is laying down, resting. So Cain, there's a goat or a sheep, a lamb, right outside the door, right within your reach, nearby, that is just lying down, resting. You can go there and you can get this blood sacrifice. You can get this animal, this sin offering, and you can come and you can make sacrifice with the blood offering just as your brother did, and I will accept you. Now the rest of that Scripture, it says this. So the sin offering is lying, resting nearby within your reach, and its desire is for you. So you have to say, it's, who's the it's here? Okay? Well, the personal pronoun there could be his desire, her desire, its desire. What's the it? Let's think back now to what I told you earlier, that Cain was the firstborn. And the firstborn had the right of being the brother's keepers. That is why in the story of Joseph, Reuben, who was the firstborn, said, no, let's don't kill him. Let's just throw him in the pit. And Scripture says he intended to come back and to get him out of the pit. But of course, when he came back, the brothers had sold him into slavery. Reuben makes a statement here. He says, if this has happened to him, what shall happen to me? Now, there are a lot of prophetic implications there, but one of them is that, look, I'm the firstborn, and I have allowed this to happen to my younger brother. Now, what is going to happen to me? All right, So Reuben accepted the responsibility of the firstborn. So here Cain, although he brought the offering, he initiated the bringing of the offering, Cain here, he's the firstborn, so he had rule, R-U-L-E, he had rule over Abel as the firstborn. So God here's saying, there's a sin offering, Cain, that is right outside the door. Abel's desire is for you, and you shall rule over him. In other words, there are more English words here than there are in the Hebrew. Okay? The Hebrew only says, much like we find this same phrase when it's talking about the woman, where most English translations said, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now, I've already explained that. The word husband there is just ish. The woman's desire was going to be for an ish that she would conceive and bear. And that ish, that man-child, which is Yeshua, is going to rule over her. Is going to, or not even over her, but is going to rule. Yes, he's going to rule over her. But my point, he's going to rule over her and Adam and everyone else. He's going to rule. It's the same language here. So that if Cain wants things to be in their proper order, a sin offering lies at the door. Desire for you, you shall rule. So Abel's desire will fall back into the proper order, that his desire will be for the older brother, the firstborn, and you are going to rule over Abel if you put things in their proper order and do what is required of you and go and get this sin offering and make this right and do this my way. Then things will fall back into their proper order. So that is another similarity there. It's not one of the main ones, but that is also another similarity there in the language with the desire and the ruling over. And this is what it means. So we find now in verse 8, let me see how much time I have here. We find here in verse 8 that the story continues now. And this is where I'm going to finish up with this lesson. But in verse 8 it says, now Cain talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Now this is where we're gonna finish here. So the scripture bears out that they talked. They were in the field and they talked. What did they talk about? Well, the rabbis, and I don't believe everything that ancient rabbis taught, but let's just, we can figure this out ourselves. What were they talking about? Well, they were talking about what transpired. I'm quite sure that, the rabbis say that Cain was defending his position and that Abel was defending God's position. We know that Abel was the righteous seed because of everything that is said in the Bible about him all the way through to the book of Revelation. The righteous blood of Abel cries out from the ground. How many times do we hear that in the scriptures? So Abel was defending God's side, and Cain, you got to do this right. You can't do this your way. You must do this God's way. All right, where Cain was making excuses for himself. And so, being brothers, siblings do this anyway, they probably got into an argument there in the field. And of course, then Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and we know what happened. He killed him. Now, I think, again, there's more there than just, okay, they got into a little argument and Cain slew Abel. But we're going to pick up there next time. And until then, shalom.